Hey.
Okay. Hey, Colleen, you're a little lower than me.
Am I? I sit on that phone book. I think.
Yeah,
I've got lots of books here I could sit on.
We're the same height when we stand next to each other, which is always much larger than anybody thinks it is.
How about that?
Oh, okay. And I could make myself a little lower, so
you could do that.
Yeah.
There you go.
Right. Colleen Chris Anderson in Windsor.
Chris Anderson is actually in Windsor. Yeah. 2 weeks running. And Rick Byer, you look like you're back from the Seven Seas, and you're more tan.
I'm still kind of trying to get my land legs back. I'm swaying side to side. Have you been dancing the Windsor Waltz lately?
No, I didn't know there was such a
Vera
thing.
Lane. Check it out. Windsor
Vera
Waltz.
Lane or Vera Lynn?
Yeah, one of those guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, not Music Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of tours at military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. Whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast, we're glad you're here. And today we'll be talking about a long secret piece of World War II scientific research related to things underwater and things D-Day. And speaking of calendar, Chris, today I believe is Remembrance Day.
It is
not in the UK.
Yeah. Today is Remembrance Sunday, so we're all wearing our poppies, and there were services at all the war memorials in the UK today. And there's the big parade down by the Cenotaph in London. And, yeah, it's a very important day.
And tomorrow, of course, will be Veterans Day here in the United States. So we want to thank all the veterans in our audience and all the veterans who we have talked about in the show over the past 4 3/4 years.
That's insane.
Yeah, we want to take a moment to thank all of our Patreon supporters, especially our Top Shelf supporters. And we got a new Patreon supporter this week, not a Top Shelf supporter, so they're not on this list, but they are a new Patreon supporter. So thank you, and you can become a Patreon supporter and help us bring you this history by going to patreon.com/historyhappyhour. Chris, do we have anybody in the audience out there?
We do, in fact. We have Sharon Peterson, and we have various Facebook users. So we hope whoever they are, they're enjoying themselves. And Lynn Hargrove is back with us. Barry Milgate from Stafford, UK. Ross W. from Antioch, California. So, yeah.
Oh, okay. See a few other people. Sarah Hendrich, David Picker. And many others. So I think we can dispense with further ado, right? And get the show on the road.
All right. Bing. Wow, the bell seems like is the bell a little seasick? It's not quite. There was that resonance there. There you go.
Okay. You have to say the bar is open.
The bar is open.
I can't go on unless, you know.
The bar is in fact open, yes.
Okay, the bar is open. Yes. So, Chris, this week's show is a deep dive. See what I did there? Into some top secret research done in World War II, a previously little known tale of British scientists who helped develop some cutting-edge underwater science that made D-Day possible. And to talk about it, we're going to welcome Dr. Rachel Lance, who is the author of Chamber Divers, the untold story of the D-Day scientists who changed special operations forever. And I want to say that Dr. Lance is a biomedical engineer and blast injury specialist who works as a scientific researcher on military diving projects. And she spent several years as an engineer for the United States Navy, working to build specialized underwater equipment for use by Navy divers, SEALs, and others. She's also the author of the book In the Waves, My Quest to Solve the Mystery of a Civil War Submarine. She lives in North Carolina. Rachel Lance, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. I've got my wine ready.
Didn't even have to ask her about it.
I know, right? She's already sort of
moved up and ready to go. Chris, did you bring a cocktail today?
Glenturret.
All right. Well, I've got some Glenmorangie, and I don't know if you can read my glass.
No, I can't.
Okay.
That's a lot of words.
It says Edinburgh Castle. So
very good.
A little toast
very
of
appropriate.
Scotland there.
Very appropriate for this story.
There is some Scotland in this show.
Absolutely.
Rachel, you're a scientist, and you're obviously interested in things that go boom underwater. And this story was so secret at the time and so little known today. How did you come across it, and what made you want to write about it?
Oh gosh, it's one of those stories of becoming obsessed with a really niche little incident in history and then chasing it until you kind of crack it open like a geode, right? And I think that there are so many stories about World War II like that, especially because we're in an era now where the documents are starting to be declassified, but the people who actually did the work have mostly passed away. And this story began for me when I was looking at this weird paper from 1941 about a group of British scientists who really cared a lot about carbon dioxide. And they weren't specific about why. They just described this experiment that they had all done on themselves to figure out essentially what level of carbon dioxide made them projectile vomit. Which is a pretty, yeah, I know, right?
It's always good to get projectile vomiting into the show really early. We like that.
If I go a day without mentioning projectile vomiting, I haven't done my job as a scientist.
All right.
What really caught my attention about that is I think every piece of science needs to be evaluated in its historical context. And since this scientific paper came out in 1941, and they were British scientists working out of London, this means that they were doing this work in 1940. So they were doing this work in the middle of the Blitz. And for some reason, they cared enough about projectile vomiting to be doing this while bombs were falling around their lab. And that just didn't add up to me. And so I kept chasing it until I figured out what they were working on. And it turned out what they were working on was the question of the British submarine HMS Thetis, which had sunk in June of 1939. And while that was one of the first experiments that they did looking at this question of underwater survival, it was by no means the last. They had actually sprung off of that. The Admiralty had asked them to keep going. And so that paper was only the very beginning. And from there, they started doing actually hundreds of experiments on themselves. Yeah. Once I realized that their ultimate goal was actually D-Day, that's when I was like, this is a book.
So what exactly is the problem? What is the other than, of course, the most effective projectile vomit that you can do? What is actually the problem that they're compelled to solve?
The problem is that we don't know how to breathe underwater as human beings. We can't do it naturally. And so we have to do it scientifically. Even now, we have to do it scientifically. But in 1940, 1939, this is before Jacques Cousteau has even invented scuba, right? He was working on that in Nazi-occupied France also during World War II. So these groups were not communicating with each other at all at the time. Before that, diving had always just been hard hat diving, meaning men of honor, giant, what we call bubblehead suit, big metal helmet, surface supply ship, bunch of people up there helping pump air down to you. And all of a sudden, World War II starts. We really want the Allies wanted the ability to approach from the sea because of the geography of continental Europe, but doing it with that kind of diving with these bottom plotters and the surface ships was not exactly going to be a stealthy military approach. So these scientists and engineers who were working on it really needed to figure out how to keep people alive underwater for the first time without using this setup of constant refreshing the air of instead they wanted to send in the first divers and the first mini subs essentially.
So you said that the thing that kind of started this was the sinking of the HMS Thetis. Can you talk a little bit about just very briefly like what happens with the HMS Thetis, which sinks in water that's not very deep, and why this suddenly gets everyone like, oh my God, we got a problem here we have to solve?
Yes, the Thetis was this huge watershed moment for all of the Allies because it even wasn't the only submarine to go down. Within a span of 3 weeks, we lost the USS Squalus, the American sub, on a training mission. We lost the HMS Thetis, the British sub, on a training mission. And we lost the French Phoenix on a training mission. So all three of these major allied countries lost submarines when they were literally just in friendly shallow waters practicing. The thetis was, in my opinion, the most informative, because from that one, 4 divers escaped using free swimming breathing apparatuses. The British had built these and put them inside all of the submarines, assuming that if a sub went down, then they would be able to just put these on and breathe into them, and everybody could swim up to safety. But the Thetis, which was in water so shallow that the stern was actually visible at low tide, 103 people are on board and only 4 managed to get out using this technique. And those 4 are in extremely rough shape. They are on death's door, even despite the breathing apparatuses. So that was this huge moment for the Admiralty most bluntly, and then for the Allies in general, when they realized war is coming. It's going to be a nautical war. We saw what happened in World War I with Germany. They heavily utilized these U-boats. And also, we don't actually know how to survive very well in these submarines we've built. And we definitely don't know how to escape from them, because the problems of underwater science were a lot more complicated than they had given them credit for. That was how they learned the hard way that these breathing gases that we need to have are really, really critical, not only to survival, but to the way we function and our ability to function.
Oh, so one of the things I loved about the book, and as anybody who knows me will tell you, I am absolutely not a scientist. So lots of some of the terms, I was like, I took some getting used to. But what I found so compelling about the book, and I'm sure anybody else who reads it will find it equally as compelling, is the cast of characters is just amazing. These people are just like almost, if you saw them in a movie, you'd be like, really? So, maybe start with Haldane. Tell us a little bit about some of this collection of people that think, hey, I'm just going to become a human guinea pig. So a little bit about them, where they come from, why they think being a human guinea pig is a great idea,
I don't think they thought it was a great idea, but I think they think it was the only option, right? And right. So if there's
what about
no, I'm not disagreeing
like
with
sheep
you.
and goats and
yeah. So first of all, the history of dive science has used animals. That just historically, people have used animals. It started with goats, like in the 1800s. So yes, that's true, but that was actually Haldane's dad who was doing those experiments. And through them, Haldane's dad, and then therefore his son, JBS Haldane, decided that it's better. Oh, that's a great picture. Yeah, it's better to use humans because humans can report all the fine nuances of what they're feeling. So not only do you have full informed consent with people who have agreed to do this, but you have people who are going to tell you, like, my left elbow is a little bit itchy, where you're not necessarily going to get that level of detail from a goat. So in this scenario where there's literally bombing of England and Hitler is rampaging, and they know that eventually this science that they're developing is going to be used in this massive world war in order to try and save lives, they decided that it was so important that they needed the level of information that they could really only get from human beings. And as scientists, they said, well, we're the ones that really understand this. We understand what neurological trauma is supposed to feel like. We understand what decompression sickness is supposed to feel like. And if we're not willing to do it on ourselves, then it's really not fair for us to ask anybody else. So yeah, this band of like quirky nerds who I really kind of related to decided that was what they could contribute. That's what they had to give to the war effort.
And I should add, like, what they're doing, it is incredibly dangerous, right? This isn't just kind of mildly inconvenient or you get a headache. You talk about some pretty traumatic physical repercussions from doing this, right?
That's exactly right. Among the things that they were studying were not just decompression sickness, which we know is the bends. That one's the most commonly known underwater ailment, I think. But they were also looking at less known things like oxygen toxicity. They were looking at hypercapnia, which is high carbon dioxide. And going into World War II, people had a vague idea. They knew that these these conditions existed, but nobody had really pushed them to the limits that you physically can experience underwater because you're under this increased pressure, right? So this group was, by definition, putting their bodies in these scenarios where no human being had gone intentionally before, and definitely where no human being had reported back from. So every single time they started an experiment, they had the possibility that something new and terrifying would happen to them that nobody else had ever experienced in the history of science. And I tried to write that in. Like, I don't know how successful I was, but I tried, when I was writing these experiments, I wanted to give people that feeling that each one of these tiny stories could be boring and just end normally and just be a data point, or it could end in catastrophe, because some of them did. Some of them ended with seizures and broken backs and dislocated jaws and stuff like that. So,
well, Rachel, if it makes you feel any better, several times when I was reading it, I did say to myself, "Are you out of your effing mind?" So I think you conveyed that pretty well.
So
good. I'm glad to terrify you, Chris.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about what these scientists actually did. So this is a picture, and you've got JBS Haldane in the background, and I can't remember who's in the foreground there. And they are cramming themselves into some sort of tank. And I know that you've been in similar tanks because I found a picture of you on the internet in one, and you've done that as part of your research. But what exactly are they doing, and what is it like inside these tanks, which are become pressurized tanks?
Yes. So the common term is hyperbaric chamber. And if you break that word down,
Not that common where I come from, but go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. The more common term. The terminology is hyperbaric chamber, we'll call it that. So we all know what chamber is. That's just the standard term. And then hyper from the Latin for high, and then baric as in pressure. So like think barometric pressure. So it's literally just any kind of compartment where you can elevate the pressure. The reason that's really important is, like I said, when you're diving and you're underwater, you have the pressure from the water around you. So in diving, every 10 meters, which is equal to 33 feet, that you go below the surface is going to be equal in pressure to one additional atmosphere. So to think about that a different way, we're all kind of sitting mostly on the ground right now. Some people might be like up in a treehouse, whatever, but we're all essentially under one atmosphere of pressure. It's the air that we're breathing above us. Every time you go 33 feet below the ocean, you're adding another one of those to your body. And a chamber is a really great way to create that added pressure by pumping high pressure gas into the space without needing to actually go in the ocean and deal with all the additional variables that you can get in the ocean, like weather. So you can do a lot more of a controlled and intentional scientific experiment. So that's what they started using these chambers for. They were putting themselves inside these tubes, which most of the time are either metal tubes or acrylic tubes in modern times. At that time, they were metal, and they were pressurizing themselves to simulate underwater. So what they're breathing on right there is early prototypes and early models of underwater breathing apparatuses. So those same models were eventually going to be used to not only help scout the beaches of Normandy, but those same models were what was developed in order to send divers in to clear the beaches of ordnance during and after the landings and things like that. So they got tested first in a metal tube in London.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just kind of throw in a question here and kind of add on to it, but Lynn wants to know, what was the communication between the Admiralty and the U.S. Navy on this research? And I would tack on to that, what's the state of this research amongst other nations? Because I got a sense when I was reading the book that everybody's kind of doing their own thing there for a while, and some with more success than others.
Everybody was very much doing their own thing. I will say it started mostly with Italy. The Italians started out pretty far in advance. As the British started kind of capturing Italian equipment, things like that, they discovered that there was a huge amount of overlap in the way that they were doing it and approaching this problem. And then the same thing with the Germans. As they started capturing German equipment, German breathing apparatuses, they realized all of these nations were working on the same problem. The British and the US had what I consider to be a bit of a healthy division of labor. So they were, in theory, openly communicating. In practice, because it was World War II, it was 1940s, they were a little bit more limited than the scientists wanted to be, because things were supposed to go through the government. But in theory, they had open communication, and they sort of subdivided the tasks. So you see the Brits, especially in London, doing all of this underwater science, doing this incredible underwater physiology research. And then the Americans were more working on the high altitude aspects of it. Because the same exact problems, this might seem strange, but the same exact problems occur for aviators and pilots. So you have the same issues in terms of needing to control the balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide and decompression sickness. Fighter pilots can get decompression sickness. So that's how the two countries had divided. The scientists worked really hard to trade information directly with each other. And I do know that this British group with Haldane at the lead was sending as much as they could to the Americans who were interested in it. But yeah, like with many government collaborations, the bureaucracies above them were an obstacle sometimes. So.
Well put.
So I want to mention, I forgot to mention earlier, but I do want to, first of all, say a thank you to our audience member, Ron Dries, who's the one who introduced us to your book. And so,
hi, Ron.
Yeah, there you go. You say hi to Ron. I was going to ask you to do that, but you're way ahead of us. Chris mentioned characters in this story, and one of the main characters is a person whose name, and we've talked about it, we did show his picture before, is JBS Haldane. And talk to us a little bit about him, because he is really quite an amazing person. He's a scientist, although he doesn't really have a science degree, and he certainly doesn't have a degree in the research that they're doing in World War II, but somehow he is a very aggressive scientific figure who, by the way, I went on his Wikipedia page, because he has a big, long Wikipedia page about all he's done, which mentions nothing that's in your book, because that is still, I guess, you have exposed something that's so new that it doesn't even make it to his Wikipedia page so far. But talk to us a little bit about him. Yeah.
I've maybe we'll have to go add some.
Yeah, I think you should go edit his Wikipedia page.
We'll have to go edit. Well, I will say there have been about 4 biographies written about JBS Haldane, because, like you said, he is this really interesting person. He was born in 1892 into this really wealthy family that was Scottish by heritage, but he was born in England because his dad was a professor, I'm pretty sure, at Oxford. And he kind of just grew up in, I don't want to insult my family. I love my family very much, but I feel like this is a dream family for me as a science nerd, because they just sort of did science together all the time. And this is including with his younger sister, Naomi, and with his mother, Louisa Kathleen. So the family of 4, like, they had a lab in their home. Instead of pets that are conventional, they use their pets for, like, looking at inheritance. Like, his sister Naomi and him were studying inheritance with her pet guinea pigs, and looking at the patterns in the fur. So stuff like that. And it was very math-based and science-based from birth. So these people also were incredibly wealthy. This was like a historically wealthy family, and they had all the funds. And I think that because they had all of their own independent money, they were sort of free to be as quirky as they wanted. And so they really just followed their passions for math and science as hard as they possibly could. What that meant was that JBS Haldane's background was actually in the classics. His degree was in the classics, in literature. And then he became a professor of genetics at University College London. He didn't have any formal training in it. He just had sort of been raised that way, like in a bathtub of it psychologically. So he was very qualified, but not on paper. And I think that was kind of an interesting way to assess his qualification, because
go ahead. No, I was gonna say, and then genetics is not what we're talking about in the World War II. So
right. So all of the lab members were geneticists. They were early geneticists, and they were very good statisticians. But the reason that they got into diving problems is, first of all, because JBS Haldane had worked on them with his dad. His dad was a very famous diving physiologist, so he had that background already. But then the key to so many of these problems is actually statistics. And since they were working on genetics before the invention of, or the discovery of the structure of DNA, the way that field was done was through statistics. So this group was able to bring that huge amount of statistical knowledge and apply it to these diving problems instead. So the math wasn't that different, which is kind of beautiful and cool.
So Rachel, one of the things that I think we need to kind of talk about is when you're talking about Haldane at the beginning, you've got the thetis, you've got how are guys going to get out of submarines. It seems to be almost a life-preserving sort of investigation. But in the book, we're transitioning, right? And so eventually this becomes, hey, we can use this in this war, and this can be used for a variety of things. So maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of that transition and some of the ways that plays out. And I just want to also say, hats off for including the Canadians at the start of your book, because all books are better when you start with the Canadians. Anyway, moving on.
I have a feeling you're really biased about this, Chris.
No, never.
Oh my God. You can write a book so long about Chris's biases on this subject.
So okay. Well, now you've created an organizational problem for my brain. But,
sorry.
Essentially, what happened was the fetus went down, and like we talked about, but this group stepped up without being asked. This Haldane originally started with some of his veteran buddies. He'd volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War because he was super opposed to fascists. And so him and his veteran buddies had done this, but they all had other jobs, so they couldn't commit themselves to science full time. And the Admiralty realized, this guy is our ticket. This guy understands the physiology. No one else, we don't have anybody else to do this. And they literally sound desperate. And I'm not exaggerating. Their letters to him and the lab at that point become begging. They're begging for more data. And so what ends up happening is those groups are also not even organized. There's the submarine group. There's the people who are dealing with submarine escape, which is different. There are people who want to build mini subs, which is like one niche guy who's pushing for that. And then on top of it, they're just beginning to have this idea that these same tools they gave for submarine escape could maybe be used on purpose. So Haldane suggested that to the Admiralty. He wrote like a letter that he sort of buried in as much classification as he could muster as a civilian. It's not clear who else suggested that. There were also people in the US who were suggesting the same idea in parallel, for sure. But at that point, they weren't talking to each other yet. They did connect by the end of the war. But they now have all of these multiple thrusts for which they all want human data about survival underwater. And so Haldane and this group, they end up getting these pleading letters with, not even kidding, laundry lists of like 13 or 14 different questions that the Admiralty all wants answers to. And just to give you a spoiler, some of these are still things we're researching today. Like as an underwater physiologist, some of the things that they asked him in 1940, I still can't answer in 2024. So this was a huge amount of tasking they gave him. And he and his group honestly just start trying to prioritize it as best as they could. So trying to write that part of the transition where they were basing what they were doing based on the military priority at the time was really complicated. And what ended up happening was, like you said, Chris, 1942, August 19th, The majority Canadian forces land at Dieppe. They didn't have enough scouting information. In my opinion, that was probably the major issue, because if they'd had that, I'd like to think they would have picked a different beach, or at least come up with a different approach. And that really hammered home that what needed to happen before any successful beach landing was scouting of the beaches in advance. So that was this pivot point, and that's why I opened the book with it in the prologue, because that was the point where they realized, we cannot achieve this. We cannot win this war without the ability to survive underwater enough to approach a beach and get information in advance of these troops that were landing.
So I want to remind everybody that we are chatting with Rachel Lane, who is the author of the book Chamber Divers, The Untold Story of the D-Day Scientists Who Changed Special Operations Forever. So, Rachel, I'd like to tell you about my vacation this summer. Okay. Because,
make sure I didn't start showing pictures of it. Jesus.
I do. I have some pictures. I did. I want to share some pictures. So we took a tour of Scotland.
Amazing.
A bus tour. And we stopped at this beautiful loch, and there were many beautiful views. And so here I took a nice view in front of the bridge, wearing the same sweater that I'm wearing today, which is a complete coincidence. And after I took this picture, I looked over in the other corner of the parking lot, and some people had walked out onto that bridge, and I saw this marker, and I said, well, what's that marker? I want to go see that marker. And this is what the marker was. And you probably can't read it very well, but it's a marker to a memorial to the 12th Submarine Flotilla. And when I looked them up, I saw that this was a flotilla of miniature submarines called X-Craft in World War II, because this is Loch Cairnbane, which is where the X-Craft officers trained. And these were miniature submarines, like two-person submarines. How was the research, because this is a big part of your book also, how was the research done by Haldane and his team important to the X-Craft, and how were the X-Craft important to D-Day?
First of all, I'm so jealous that you got to go. That is really exciting.
Which was the main point in showing the picture.
Just to inspire me with jealousy. I'm dying to go there. I wrote this book mostly during the pandemic. And so I was kind of reliant on locals to send me like footage of stuff. So I had a Scottish friend who had been in that area a lot, sent me a ton of videos, and then read the sections in advance for me to make sure they felt accurate. But I'm dying to go. So, okay. So Loch Cairnbane, as you know, is this very remote loch in Scotland. And the reason that it was selected for this was because it was so hard to get to, and they could control access to it. These X-Craft, which are also pictured on the cover of the book, were tiny submarines that, like I said, were originally the passion project of just one or two particular submariners who thought that they had incredible utility. This idea of what we call midget subs has been around for quite some time. Like, my first book was about one that was during the American Civil War, called the H.L. Hunley. But the issue with these that nobody had been able to solve yet is that when you are in a smaller space, the breathing gas dynamics become a lot more complicated and tricky. So the way I'd like to compare it is, imagine if you're in an airplane or even a house. Like, you're generally pretty sealed, depending on the house, but like, you're generally pretty sealed. But because it's such a large volume compared to the number of people inside, you have a really long time before you start to have any problems with oxygen or carbon dioxide. You essentially are able to replenish the atmosphere on a time scale that's faster than the way that you're going to kind of breathe down your gas supply. In a submarine, in general, that problem gets worse. But for the most part, large-scale submarines had always been successful just because they were able to go to the surface. And the submariners inside were able to bring them to the surface when they needed to. Essentially, their batteries would run out before the gas supply ran out. But once you make that even smaller, you've now gone from living inside of a house to trying to live inside of a plastic bag around your head. So that's obviously a more terrifying scenario that we should all be more uncomfortable with. And the reason for that is because when you have that smaller volume, you're going to be contaminating your breathing gas faster. You're going to be using your breathable air a lot faster. The same thing is happening inside these midget stubs. Carbon dioxide is going to build up way, way faster. Oxygen is going to run down way, way faster. And you therefore need to understand the principles behind how our body balances those and how we need to manage them in the air before you can survive in that atmosphere for any kind of amount of time. Like, I could keep you alive inside of a plastic bag, but it's going to take more work than inside of a house. So Haldane and his group, the other gentleman pictured in the chamber was Martin Case. That was one of the first things that they started working on, was modeling these submarines. So in this photo, they're testing breathing apparatuses. They're not doing submarine work. But the two of them really climbed in these chambers and used these chambers as models for what it was like inside these tiny vessels, inside these X-craft. And they calculated and measured how much oxygen they needed to bring, how much scrubber material they needed to bring, because carbon dioxide is a huge problem that everyone forgets about, and things like that. And they were the ones who handed the prescriptions for those to the fleet and the submariners to tell them what they needed to do in order to survive the missions that they wanted to implement.
So Rachel, I'm going to throw up another question here. This one is from Wally, and it's going to kind of feed into what would be one of my questions. Is he wants to know why the research was such a priority for the Admiralty, given that most of the ocean in the English Channel is deeper than the shallow water sinkings that made them aware. And and then from there we can lead into kind of the particulars of D-Day, maybe. Yeah,
spectacular question. And this is actually still a question today that the Navy struggles with. The question still, like, even today when we talk about submarine sinkings, we struggle with the idea of what depth is considered survivable and how to help people and submariners in a disabled submarine at various depths, because the prescriptions for that are different, right? Like in the middle of the English Channel, Wally's absolutely right. That's a different scenario than where the HMS D-Day sank. The reason that this was a priority is because eventually they wanted to land in continental Europe. So anytime you're going to land in especially in continental Europe, you have to approach through these littoral regions. And they were not planning for sunken submarines at this point. They're planning for intentional use of things like X-craft and the divers in these shallow water regions, so that people are operating in these shallows on purpose, as opposed to simply surviving an accident.
Okay. So we've talked about the research that they're doing, which and what they did to themselves, which you talk about in great detail, and every pain and every knee and every collapsed lung and
punctured eardrum,
compressed spine and all that these guys put themselves through, which is pretty amazing. But what this makes possible with the X-craft, it makes possible the use of the X-craft, which then do monstrous damage to the turrets, which is one of their big achievements. But what it also makes possible is the recon of the beaches, specifically something called Operation Postage Able at Omaha Beach. So tell us about that. I mean, that's kind of it's the exciting result of this. Tell us about that and what important information they were able to learn from it. And when it happened and all those details and stuff.
Yeah. This was something that it first of all blew my mind, and second of all made me feel almost negligent as a dive scientist and a dive history nerd, because I had never heard about Operation Postage Able before. So this was essentially, sorry, my tiny dog has joined me. She's off camera, but this is essentially, she says hi. This was essentially one of the operations that they launched to scout the beaches. Now, the Allies knew in advance where they wanted to target in France. There were several options, but based on the disaster at Dieppe, they also knew that they needed more information going in order for this to be a success. For example, some of the things that caused the failure at Dieppe was they weren't aware of the angle of the beaches. So a lot of the vehicles had a hard time climbing the beach that was in a way that was unexpected. They weren't aware of the composition of the beaches. So many of the tanks had not been tested on that specific type of material before. It turned out to be rocks, not sand. The rocks got stuck in the treads. A lot of them threw their treads off. Some of them literally caught on fire from it. So that's obviously something that logically it could be dismissed, like what's the texture of the beach, right? But because of that combined with their vehicles, that was a huge problem in that scenario. And then they also didn't have a lot of information about the updated beach defenses. Obviously, the Germans had changed the environment since the start of the war, and they realized that that was a lot bigger of a problem than they'd imagined. So before Normandy, before D-Day, they really wanted to avoid making those same mistakes again, which is incredibly laudable. And in my opinion, one of the things that was really successful about one of the things that led to the success of the landings. Operation Positivo in particular, they went to these beaches, they sent these X-craft. These X-craft were, and you have to imagine, this picture shows the whole boat. This is the whole thing. So what they would do is, because they were able to process the air inside, they were able to send them to the bottom 18 hours a day. So these men inside, there were, I believe, 4 of them on each mission, but don't quote me on that without fact checking. But there were 4 of them inside. There's no room to stand because this is the whole size of the boat. There's additional equipment, there's electronics, there's all kinds of gear in there. And for 6 hours a night, they would come up to the surface, they would replenish their air, and 2 swimmers would go from the submarine to the shore. So these guys were in like these original canvas suits. So yes, this photo is from a little bit later in the war. These were not quite the suits that they were wearing for this particular mission, but you're not terribly far off. But they were covered in pockets, and they had these like bandolier sashes, right? And they were filled with test tubes. And so they would crawl ashore and they would sample the sand, and they were taking measurements of the sand, and they were measuring the beaches, right? And there's this one incredible moment that for me just absolutely invested my whole heart into the moment, where the guy's trying to get ashore and he can't keep the sample in the tube. And he knows this is a part of the beach that will be exposed and that the tanks will be on. So instead of getting the sample in the tube, because every time he goes down to get one, he gets hammered by a new wave, he gets tossed around, the sample gets lost, it gets washed out. So he goes down and he just grabs a fist of the stuff and he rubs it all over his face. And that's his way of like assessing the texture in that area. And so then he writes that down when he gets on shore, what that felt like. That was all the information he could provide. So from that, they're dealing with actual Germans on the beaches as they're doing it. They're watching where the Germans are walking. They're saying, that's not a minefield because they're playing football here. Things
they
like
found
that.
Footprints in one, right?
Exactly. They found footprints. Okay, they're comfortable walking here. Things like that. And they made more updated maps. One of the things that was the most powerful for me about these entire operations, which do then get absolutely rolled into the Allies' guidance for D-Day, is what they'd said about Omaha Beach. In their notes about Omaha Beach, they specifically said, this beach is going to require the best navigators. This beach is going to be really hard to identify. And if you miss even slightly, there are massive guns on either side. So we now know that that was true. We now know that that's exactly what happened. They also said this beach, there are runnels. So there are essentially kind of ditches in the water. So they said there will be boats that beach on the high parts and offload people, and there will be troops that drown in these runnels unless we don't prepare everyone carefully in advance. I don't know to what degree the British transmitted that information to the Americans. I don't know. I haven't been able to find those records. But I think it's so powerful to see in the records that they wrote that down. They anticipated the landing efforts and the obstacles to landing that the Americans would experience on this beach, and they were 100% right about it.
Well, yeah, I would say that I know that I had come across a reference a while ago. I don't know if it's specifically if it was an expo team, but there are British divers that investigate Omaha Beach, and they come back and they report to General Bradley, and they say, General, this is going to be a real shit show.
Yeah.
And the account is basically Bradley, puts his arm around him and says, "Yep, I know."
Yeah, they said that this would be the hardest one, and here are the problems you'll run into.
Yeah. So
we're right.
So obviously they're providing this information, and we don't have time to talk about everything because you go to great lengths about the Italians at Alexandria and the Tirpitz, and there's all other kinds of things that lead up to this, and so we've been talking about those operations kind of scouting before D-Day, but then of course they get involved on the day itself. And I love one of the quotes of one of the COP crew. They say that the X-Craft were cold-blooded and unpleasant duty.
Yeah.
So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that cold-blooded and unpleasant duty on June 6th itself, what they're doing, and then also maybe elaborate a bit, because you talk about how they do certain things on the British beaches that they don't do on the American beaches, and it's all sort of similar but sort of different.
Yeah. So COP, the acronym meaning Combined Operations Pilotage Parties. Yes. That was a group, and those were the personnel who were extra trained in scouting. So pilotage meaning like scouting. That was specifically their job. So they were trained in navigation, they were trained in maps. So what they did was they went over the channel or across the channel in the X-Craft a few days in advance. And their job was just to mark the beaches. So they marked the British and the Canadian beaches. What they reported later was that the Americans declined the service. But I haven't found a contemporary record of that, but I have no reason to disbelieve it. But they went over and they simply anchored off the coast, especially of Sword, and they simply formed the perimeter. Because each of these 5 landing sites, Sword, Gold, Juneau, Omaha, Utah, was picked to be in a gap. It was picked to be in a gap between the massive batteries that the Germans had either repurposed or built. And so the goal there was obviously to minimize casualties by not landing directly in front of the guns like they had at Dieppe. So if you missed like they did at Omaha, you could end up directly in front of a battery, which was bad. And so on the borders of Sword and Gold, as well as Juneau, they had these X-Craft stationed out there a few days in advance. They would spend the days underwater on the bottom. And then at night, they would come up and listen to coded transmissions sent across on the radio to see if the invasion was on for the next day. Now, as we all know, it was originally supposed to be June 5th. It was delayed a day because of the weather. But then what had happened on June 6th, they got the message that the invasion was on. And so they came to the surface at the appropriate time, and they had a special directional beacon that they pointed out to sea. And in this way, they bracketed the beaches and the landing sites to minimize how many troops would end up in front of these massive batteries. And they used this flashing beacon as the signal to bring everybody in, so that on this day, all they had to worry about were, the obstacles and the waves and the guns. But at minimum, they didn't have to worry about very precision beach scouting and landing. As the night turned to day, they replaced that lightning signal with a big flag. And they continued to guide these ships in until the invasion had been established on the beachhead. So one of the things that I thought was so fascinating was listening to oral histories and listening to narratives from some of the personnel who were there. And there was one gentleman, and I don't remember his name, but I did include him in the book. He talked about how they had been all given shots of rum before they went in, for courage. And I can't imagine it helped the coordination, but they'd been given shots of rum. And so as they start approaching the beach, he saw one of the X-Craft crews, one of these COP personnel, standing on top of the hull of the boat with this giant flag with this signal. and he began to doubt his own eyes because it looked like this guy was just standing on the water. So I thought that was such a fascinating way to talk about that perspective of the landing, and especially like how this extraordinary degree of preparation had at least removed this one variable of uncertainty for everybody.
Yeah. So when I finished the book, something that I was left with, and it's immediately underscored in the beginning of the acknowledgments, was that you take a very dim view of people who steal credit from others, especially male scientists who deny it to female scientists. Can you talk about some of the women who may have been overlooked, and if you wish to, talk about some of the men who did the overlooking?
Yeah, I don't take as you mentioned, I don't take a positive view of people who steal credit, because in my opinion, if you genuinely respect someone and you respect their work, you acknowledge how much effort they put into it. And I think that when you don't do that, and when you especially use your opportunity or your power to take credit for their work, you are showing that you as a person are also pretty biased and problematic. So in this, and this happens unfortunately to female scientists even today. So in this book, there were several women in this lab. And I thought that was one of the fascinating parts, because most of the men who were physically capable were being drafted. And even over the course of this story, you see the male scientists in the book being drafted or signing up voluntarily. Some of them did go voluntarily for sure. But because these women are equally capable at science, and if not more so capable at statistics, like, for example, Dr. Helen Spurway, she's a PhD geneticist. This woman has statistical skills that I can't even imagine. And she becomes incredibly critical to processing that data. But because she's in this position where she is a woman and therefore she's paid less, she's given a lower title. There is a British Admiralty gentleman named Ken Donald. And I have his book. His book is right here. This book has been considered essentially the Bible for oxygen and diving since he wrote it in the mid-90s after she had died, so she couldn't rebut it. And in it, he literally plagiarizes her work. He takes it word for word and he gives himself credit. So that's unfortunately a thing, but I was really kind of honored to be able to go through the source documents and prove that it was her who did it and tell that story as well. I think I'm cautiously hopeful that stories like Helen Spurway and Rosalind Franklin the long arc of their stories will bend toward the truth over time.
Ooh. So, one of the other things, again, that I found fascinating was that obviously the direction of the book, or the emotional connection with the book, is, D-Day, they get ashore, and then you think, okay, well, their job is done. But clearly I know they keep using the X boats. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of their other operations, and of course, ultimately, most poignantly of all, sort of their final casualties.
Yeah, the reason I'm looking behind me is to see if I have one of the other books behind me handy, but unfortunately I do not. There are a couple different books that are more about the X-craft, because after their use on D-Day, the Allies are like, oh, wow, these are really useful. So a lot of them start getting repurposed, because obviously even after the end of the war in Europe, there's still ongoing war in the Pacific. The Pacific poses this whole different set of underwater problems because of the water temperature. So all of a sudden, you're no longer struggling to keep people warm. You're no longer protecting against hypothermia. You're struggling to keep people cool. So they had to create a new model of X-craft, and they had to revise some of the other ones, but they create an air-conditioned unit, and they start using them for the same type of things as their island hopping, going from island to island with these marine landing forces in the Pacific. And I thought that part was fascinating, but it was kind of outside of this book could have been 4,000 pages if I'd included all the interesting details. Yeah. But there are other books, like there's one called The Real X-Men, that talk about those operations as well. And then they also start engaging in other types of espionage. So really what you see with the X-Craft is the birth, in my opinion, of modern submarine warfare, where submarines are considered less just moving pieces of artillery and more genuine tools of espionage and stealth. So the X-Craft, I think we could debate this over beers, but I think the X-Craft.
Okay.
Okay, let's do it.
Ready to go, man.
Don't challenge me in a good time. But I think the X-Craft were really the moment where submarines kind of come into their own, especially because they could deploy divers. And so you see all these activities in the Pacific where they're deploying divers to like cut communication cables or interfere in these like sort of high
bug them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about your fascinating book, Chamber Divers, the untold story of the D-Day scientists who changed special operations forever. And there's a whole lot of it we haven't gotten into, like the fact that JBS Haldane was under investigation for almost the entire war for being a communist, which he was.
They had like MI5 spies following him while he was doing top secret admiralty work.
Right. And then all of the amazing scientists that he recruited who escaped from Nazi Germany, who were German Jews, and sort of the after story of these various people. So there's lots of interesting stuff in there that we haven't even gotten to touch on today. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you for having me. It's been really fun. Thank you for letting me info dump at you about diving history.
No, next time you're talking about sunken ships or divers or whatnot, let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, bye.
Bye. Wow, it's really quite a lot of cramming on this book on the last couple of days, and I just kept it kept having new stuff that blew my mind every few pages.
Well, it's I gotta say, and it's always it's a rare thing, but it's always it's a breath of fresh air when you read something new about D-Day.
Well, you always say, if you read a book and you learn something, and then that's a great that's a positive thing as opposed to reading just a rewrite of a bunch of stuff you already knew. So
absolutely.
Next week, Chris, we will be in encore mode because I'll be away at a
Are you ever home, Rick? You're starting to talk. Heavy sigh.
It's really hard to get people to be sympathetic with your heavy travel schedule when you spend 2 weeks on a luxury cruise ship.
It is just
it's just a little challenging.
A little bit.
We'll see.
We'll
see how you fare doing that next year. Next week, anyway, an encore episode presenting a conversation that we had with Saul David, who's the author of Sky Warriors, British Airborne Forces in the Second World War. Sort of a really wide-ranging discussion of the entire British Airborne, not just D-Day. Okay, we get into all sorts of other operations and other stuff with Saul David, who's been on the show before as well, and who's just a very knowledgeable guy, good writer, good interview. So that's a fun thing coming up next week.
Yes, it's a good show.
So please, everybody, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on X, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon. That's the most important one, Chris. Back us on Patreon.
That is the most important.
And browse us at historyhappyhour.com. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.